Hello, friends. I'm hoping this is working. It shows it's been going for 10 seconds, and it's being odd. Anyway, my apologies for the late start of this video. I seem to have forgotten how to use Facebook Live. I am not sure what happened, but uh, all of the settings and everything just wasn't there that I'm used to using. Absent-minded professor, perhaps. But I am definitely here. I'm ready to go. I hope you all are here as well and didn't give up and go home. I see there are a couple of you. So, anyway, my apologies. When I made the event last week, I seem to have not connected a live stream to it. I don't know. It's bizarre. But anyway, my name is Joseph Solar. I'm going to introduce myself as I always do and explain who I am a little bit and qualifications in case this is a first video for anyone. And the importance of this, as I state every week and will state forever and ever and ever until people get it, is that we must always consider the sources of information. We must always consider the credibility and the reliability of whatever we are being told, whatever is being shared, whatever sort of messages or supposed facts are being put forward by a speaker or an essay or an article or especially a meme. Those memes that proliferate on Facebook that are pretty much useless for sensible discussion and information. So, my name is Joseph Solar. Again, I am an adjunct faculty at Rowan College of Burlington County, which is one of the reasons why I am doing these videos. Lauren Purnell asked me to do them after questions from her sister, which are posted up there, and Lauren was a former student of mine. I hold my PhD from Temple University in urban education, where I studied educational policy and language and rhetoric, and as I like to also say, miseducation. So that's my graduate degree. My undergraduate degree is in history and African American studies, which clearly indicates why the topic of these videos is of such importance to me. It was my generating influence, and I was extremely lucky to have as instructors some of the greatest minds that I can even imagine. And as I do these videos, I always keep them in the back of my head, and my hope is that I honor what they taught me by spreading their knowledge even further afield. So today's event video is about rebellion. Last week, we were talking about the original European settlement in the United States, which of course underscores a great deal of myths because most Americans will think Jamestown and most Americans will also think European as that first settlement. Obviously, the Native Americans, first people, were here long before the Europeans arrived, but when the Europeans explored Florida, they were not just Europeans. And that's what's so important. So, the first settlement in what becomes the United States, post Native America, of course, was actually a Catholic settlement chartered by the King of Spain, which had many Africans involved, both free and enslaved, or enslaved and then becoming free. During the course of its history, this Spanish colony of Florida was entangled very heavily in conflict, war, trade during times of peace with the colony that we today know as the state of South Carolina. And it is in the state of South Carolina, rather in the colony of South Carolina, that we have one of the most, from the perspective of English slavers, unsettling slave rebellions to ever occur in colonial British North America. And I say that specifically, colonial British North America, because we must always understand that rebellions in slave owning societies are a constant threat and a frequent occurrence. And in fact, even in the originally Spanish, later English colony of Jamaica, there was a successful slave rebellion that led to the establishment of several independent towns in the interior of Jamaica, which I believe are still inhabited and people can visit them. So, to understand the events of 1739, yes, 1739, so some 40 years before the American Revolution, we have to look at this colony that we today call South Carolina, but which was originally just called the Carolina Colony, centered in the city of Charleston, or Charlestown as it was originally called. So history unfolds very gradually, and we look at history from this gradual unfolding and have to remind ourselves that this is the fact, because of course when we read a work of history, we could jump through years of time in a matter of pages and a matter of minutes. So the colony of South Carolina, or the Carolina Colony, is officially chartered by the King of England, Charles II, thus why it's Charleston, because kings are arrogant and name things after themselves, Jamestown, Charlestown, etc., in 1670. So to give you some perspective, Virginia slave laws. Virginia was established in 1607. Oh, that's what I talked about last week, Virginia slave laws. So in 1607, Jamestown was established without slavery, but with indentured servitude, and by 1670, they had transitioned significantly into creating and passing laws and establishing a legal basis for the institution of slavery in Virginia, which means that at the founding of Charleston, slavery existed and had something of a legal foundation. There's still a lot more that Virginia would create, and then, of course, the Carolina Colony would contribute to this establishment of slavery as an institution in American life, specifically targeting Africans and Native Americans to a degree as well. But the story of Carolina is different because it's, in a sense, a secondary colony. Virginia's established straight settlers from England, they shipped them over, and then they established Jamestown. Carolina, although obviously chartered in England, is established largely with settlers from Barbados. And this is where the history of the Carolina Colony diverges significantly from Jamestown, in that Barbados by 1670 had been colonized, settled, and was a jewel in the British sugar empire. Now, an aside fact, when we think of the enslavement of African peoples in the Americas, we tend to think in our United States context of cotton, 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 which makes sense because it becomes the dominant crop in the United States of America. But over the long span of the slave trade and enslavement across the many colonies in the Americas, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and the English, it is sugar that is the backbreaking money crop which motivates the enslavement of millions of Africans, or the transportation of millions of Africans, and also the enslavement of tens of thousands of Native Americans, but they did not endure the diseases tragically. So Barbados is a sugar island. And the thing about sugar islands and sugar plantation agriculture is it's backbreaking, brutal, deadly work. Part of the reason for the Haitian Revolution in 1791, the motivation and the just spontaneous uprising, what motivates enslaved people to charge cannons and muskets, wielding simply machetes and pitchforks, as the initial conflicts in Haiti were, is that it's deadly. Sugar plantation agriculture is deadly, and large percentages of those sent to work sugar will die. It also means that those who plant sugar, if they weren't originally, the sheer psychological necessity of trying to justify being rich on the back of murder makes the sugar planters, not just the French or the British, but all the sugar planters, the Cubans, etc., into monsters who are willing to turn their backs, torture, maim, and allow thousands upon thousands of African people, mostly some natives, to die for their wealth and their comfort and their privilege. And these are the people who will settle the Carolina colony. And why? What motivates Barbados sugar planters to uproot and move to the Carolinas? In fact, part of why I was a couple minutes late is I was revisiting this story for confirmation. Got to check my details. And it was pretty much because the sugar islands were able to grow lots of sugar, but from the perspective of the planters, they were wasting land by having to plant food to feed people, including themselves and their laborers. And so they were looking for a place to grow food. And so they identified this piece of the North American coast, which was a good distance away from Spanish Florida, and they hoped that they could create a sort of agricultural economy that they could use to feed the sugar islands. So the second sons and third sons of these wealthy Barbados planters got their charter for the Carolina colony, moved to the Carolinas, tried various schemes, and they didn't work. And quite literally, for the first generation, so from like 1670 to 1690, we see attempts by these British planters, sons mostly, to try different agricultural schemes to make money in South Carolina, and they don't work, and so they just get lazy, and they just turn to slave raiding. And so what they would do is they would just grab some guns, go into the back country, kidnap native people they found there, and then send them back to the sugar islands to be worked to death. Obviously, when they tried these various agricultural schemes in the Carolinas, they weren't doing the work themselves. So they, of course, imported Africans to do the work in the Carolinas of trying to build a viable agricultural economy. And of course, they used enslaved Africans alongside themselves in these raiding parties to kidnap native people to sell off to the islands. And why sell them off? Because by this point, the British had become devilish, and they realized that if you could sell off people away from home, it was easier to control them. Right? So you take the Africans and you bring them from Africa to North America, then you take the North Americans and you ship them off to the Caribbean, and at all times you are dislocating, disconnecting people from their homelands, which enables their exploitation more effectively. In other words, the British are turning slavery into an institution, into a profession that has standards, if you want to call them standards and practices by which they would operate. So they begin slave raiding, they begin planting, or they begin trying to plant various crops. They don't work. They try cattle, doesn't work. And as happens, the solution lays with the enslaved people themselves. By this point, there are multiple trading posts, slave forts, off the coast of Africa, and the British are developing their own slave trading relationships along what they will call quite directly the slave coast. So parts of Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and they're trading off. But it is Africans who recognize in the Carolina environment that this is good rice country. And there was wild rice in the Carolinas, which Native Americans would harvest and gather like Native people do today in parts of Minnesota and the North. But Africans from the kingdom, well, today's Republic of Angola, the kingdoms of Congo and Dongo, and Matamba, and that whole region of West Central Africa, had been cultivating rice for generations. Rice is a staple crop of that part of Africa. And these Angolans, I guess we don't, lost to history, some Angolan guy makes a comment that he could probably transform this land into good rice growing land. And the person who was in charge of him maybe rewarded him with freedom. It's the 1690s, anything is possible. Or maybe jacked up his price and sold him. We don't know because we don't know who the person was. But what eventually happens is by the 1690s, the English are putting in rice crops. And by putting in rice crops, I mean that the Carolina planters are increasing the purchase of Africans from Angola to bring to Carolina because they understand rice cultivation. They know how to dam up and move water. They know how to create the rice paddies. They know the exact levels of water. They know all of the science of rice agriculture. And this is significant because we don't really think, we're told to think. We're told to think that, of course, Africans who were enslaved after generations become de-skilled, brute force laborers, and maybe a few, lucky few, were artisans or whatever. But that is a very, very incorrect notion. The enslaved Africans, kidnapped, captured, brought to the Carolinas, were brought there specifically for their expertise because they had agricultural knowledge and skill that was useful. And so the Carolina colony, the outskirts of the city of Charlestown and further afield up the rivers and into the waterways, are transformed into these massive rice growing operations through the agricultural knowledge and skill of largely Angolan people. And this development transforms the Carolina colony into an extremely wealthy subsidiary of the Caribbean, but eventually into its own independent entity. It is, in essence, the rice bowl of the Caribbean, because that rice would be the primary crop that enslaved planters would serve to their enslaved population. And so we have this curious development where enslaved Africans are growing rice in the Carolina tidewaters for the purposes of feeding other enslaved Africans. And these swamplands are brutal and inhospitable, and so these enslaved Africans are often left alone in what they call a task system, where they're allowed to feed themselves with little garden plots as long as they deliver the crop. And the overseer of these various plantations would simply kind of travel around and just check up on all of the people and their particular acre or hectare, however they measured it, to make sure they were doing the work and still there. What this means is that enslaved Africans determined not to remain enslaved. And so, very, very early on, the Carolina colony experiences difficulties with runaways. And enslaved Africans are constantly running away. And when we think running away, again, we have our kind of Underground Railroad image. And even from my Florida talk, this idea of going to Florida. But very often, enslaved people didn't even have to run that far. They could literally just run further into the woods. Or in some cases, one of the great ironies is that Africans who were enslaved in Charlestown would run away into the countryside, and Africans enslaved in the countryside would run away into Charlestown, any place where they weren't known. And so the Carolina colony has this huge problem with absenteeism, the escape of these enslaved Africans. It's problematic from their perspective in terms of disorder, because with the slave trade by this point dominated by the British and the Dutch friends of theirs, they can just keep bringing in people. And that, of course, is where things get a little more chaotic. By the 1720s, the population of what is now South Carolina, because people have moved out of South Carolina north and created North Carolina already, there is a black majority in the Carolinas. And this, of course, gives a great deal of pause to the white minority in South Carolina, because they don't want to stop importing Africans because Africans know rice plantation agriculture. However, it is very often Africans who had only recently been enslaved in wars or whatever from Africa that were more likely to escape, more likely to feel the culture shock or just the sense of complete disconnection that leads to escape. Because escape is desperate. And African Americans, those born in the Americas, who were born enslaved because of the British slave law, they understand how to make a go of it. They understand ways they can get freedom or carve out freedom under this institution. Africans coming from Angola, they don't speak the language, they might not be part of the religion or any number of things, and are completely lost and disoriented, and so they just scatter. We see the Carolinians in this time period attempting to forge relationships with the Native Americans because the Native people are willing to serve as slave catchers for money and trade goods, but also because if they are the slave catchers, then they are less likely to be enslaved themselves. And so the Carolinians very early on set the two major victim groups against each other. And in fact, so developed was this notion of Native people as slave catchers that the Cherokee Nation actually has a class of warrior called slave catcher, whose specialty in the Cherokee society was to catch African runaways and return them to their plantations. Tensions between Carolina and Florida encouraged the flight of enslaved people south, and so the South Carolina colony, as it developed, it's very, very wealthy, but also very, very chaotic. And you may have heard people say about the first police forces being specifically slave catching forces. Well, the 1720s, they're definitely not police force, but the South Carolina legislature passes various patrol acts and militia acts, which requires the white population, even those who don't own slaves, the entire white population, male population, to serve time in the Carolina militias on slave patrols to help catch and round up runaways because there were so many and it was so problematic to the maintenance of their money. And so we see the development of a Carolina militia that by the 1730s is, according to contemporaneous sources, better suited for defending against internal enemies, enslaved people, than the external enemies, the Spanish, because they're specializing in slave catching rather than in standard military tactics against their mortal enemies a couple hundred miles south down in Florida. By 1733, the problem of runaways has become so pronounced that the new King of England, George, has chartered the establishment of a new colony, which would stand between Carolina and Florida, and yes, it's called Georgia. And the founders of Georgia actually were anti-slavery, I kid you not, and they were religious dissidents. It doesn't last long. But in the Georgia colony, slavery was banned, and Africans were banned. And so what King George does by creating this colony centered around the city of Savannah is he creates a buffer between the Carolinas and the Floridians, between Carolina and Florida. And so it's very clear to the governor of Georgia, Oglethorpe, that if there is any black face visible in Georgia, that person should be treated as a runaway. Or if not a runaway, should be treated as a spy or a scout for the Spanish. All throughout this period, records indicate that many Africans brought over as enslaved people were Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers, Catholics, because they're coming from Angola, which had that, by this point, 250-year history of being a Catholic nation, which, again, put that in perspective, that by the 1730s, the kingdoms of Congo and Ndongo, the kind of new fusion kingdom of Angola, had been a Catholic slave trading power itself for 250 years. So it underscores the kind of complexity of the story, but also the cultural ties and lineage that many Africans had over the centuries and this connection in this Atlantic world. So why 1739? Well, a couple of reasons. In 1739, war breaks out between England and Spain. Not only that, the Carolina legislature had recently passed a law in 1739, which was going into effect at the end of September, which would have required that all white men bear arms on Sundays in church. Sunday had always been kind of the breather, the free space for liberty for enslaved people. When their putative owners went to church on Sundays, Africans were at liberty. They could work for themselves, they could go see their families, tend to their own crops, do their own business, etc. And because of the disorder, runaways in the Carolina colony, they had been slowly constraining these liberties and freedoms. And as they recognized that they were, by 1739, the white population was a 40% of the population minority versus a 60% black majority. And then, of course, a large native population as well, which they didn't even count. They realized that they were in danger of generalized uprising. And throughout the 1730s, there are multiple incidents and conspiracies and plots uncovered. There are multiple bandits, robbers, runaways who are being captured and rounded up. And as you can imagine, as the white Carolinians become more terrified and scared of potential uprisings, their behavior becomes more violent and brutal towards those who commit infractions. And so runaways were apt to be whipped or branded or otherwise mutilated in ways that would still allow them to work, but would visibly mark them as problematic. And so one of the images that we must have in our mind when we think of enslaved people is that enslaved people bear the physical trauma of their enslavement. And by the 1730s, with the Carolinians attempting to terrorize Africans into submission, it means that more and more enslaved Africans and African Americans would bear the scars and amputations. I could get into the more gruesome details, but I shall not, of these attempts at punishment. And in fact, what these Carolinians do are horrifying things. They will put heads on pikes. They will require that executions of enslaved people be carried out by enslaved people to kind of drive home that point that this can happen to you if you're not obedient, and etc. And to a degree, it works. It's a carrot stick approach. Horrifying violence inflicted upon enslaved people. But enslaved people who betrayed plots or who helped catch runaways were often given cash prizes, nice clothes, etc. In the early days, owners might even manumit, meaning free enslaved people who helped capture runaways or betray a conspiracy. But by the 1730s, even that wasn't allowed. And in fact, in the 1730s, the Carolinians were so afraid of free people of color living in the Carolinas that they made it illegal for individuals to free enslaved people. And in fact, the owner could petition the legislature, but ultimately only the legislature could free people. That's how things became. So then 1739, it had been several years of conspiracies and plots and horrifying kind of retribution against conspirators. And so what is it about 1739? 1739, there is the war between Spain and England, which means that the colony of Florida is aggressively open for business, so to speak, to take in runaways. But we also know that there was a large collection of Africans from Angola working together on the same and adjoining plantations. The man credited as the ringleader is a guy named Jemmy, who had been a soldier in civil war in Angola. He'd been on the wrong side, and he lost and was sold off into slavery as a consequence. But he was a man who had lived his life free. And that was, of course, what the Carolinians always considered as the risk in bringing over Angolans, is that they had remembered freedom. They had lived freedom, and they had homelands that they remembered. And so Jemmy, we don't have all the details. We're still uncovering elements of this. But Jemmy and his co-conspirators, who very likely shared a common language, whether a native Congolese or Portuguese, maybe even Spanish. Many of them might have been Catholics, even, so shared a same faith, began thinking and plotting and realizing that the Sunday of the rebellion might very well be their last Sunday when they would have the liberty to launch the plot, because the new Enforcement Militia Act was going into effect, which would require all of the white settlers to go about armed, as the terms went. And so on September 17th, 1739, Jemmy and his co-conspirators rose in rebellion. They attacked their owners. Well, the overseer killed them, and then they ran to the nearest major provision store. And it was a store called Hutchinson's. And there they found the owner and another planter. They killed them both, and they treated those two men the way enslaved people had been treated, by putting their heads at the door. And they stole all the weapons they could get their hands on. They then immediately set out south down the Pon Road, as it was called. And along the way, this is where it gets particularly noteworthy, they began beating a drum. What's the significance of this? Well, conspiracies generally are going to try to be quiet. But what accounts indicate is that the drummers were not just beating a drum kind of for the noise of it. They were beating the Angolan war call. In other words, they were summoning their fellow Angolans to war, either because they had been part of the planning of the conspiracy initially, or because, as Angolans who had been enslaved and brought to the Carolinas, they would instantly recognize what that drum beat meant and come to it. And so as they burn their way down the Pon Road, they're burning plantations, they are killing plantation owners and their families, and eventually they get to Wallace's Tavern, where it turns out that the individual Wallace was considered to be a good and kindly slave owner, such as it is, but they spared him. And again, these details are important because Jemmy's rebellion, summoning these Angolan warriors and fellow Africans who might not have been Angolan and who had joined in, this was not a random spasm of arbitrary violence. They weren't just killing every white person they could find, that they had a hit list, that the people they targeted were people who were reputed to be cruel or violent or unjust, who had separated families or abused enslaved people, who were otherwise behaved abominably, because this one individual who, in their estimation, was not an abominable human being, they spare his life. They also got into the liquor, according to some accounts. And so they continue onward from Wallace's Tavern. They burn more plantations. They finally make it down to the Edisto. And it's there that they rest. Some argue that some had had a little bit too much to drink. Some argue that they couldn't cross the river, so they had to wait for the tide. Again, the records of this event are in dispute, but they were in trouble. Along the way, as they had attacked and killed people, they had come upon a lone horseman on the road who had seen them and taken off the other direction. He escaped. Turns out that guy was William Bull, the lieutenant governor of South Carolina. When Bull escaped, he immediately raised the alarm and called the South Carolina militia together. And of course, the South Carolina militia was able to gather, and they came upon these 100 or so rebels in a clearing near the river, and they attacked. The group was scattered. Several were killed initially, several were captured, and it was then a general hunt for the survivors. according to, and I'll show you the book where I get a lot of this information from, Peter Wood, although the rebellion itself lasted only a day or two, they managed to kill some 60 white people and raise an army that approached somewhere around 100 people. But the hunt for survivors, the hunt for rebels, continued for weeks. And in fact, one of Jemmy's co-conspirators stayed on the run for 3 years after this rebellion. When the rebellion was put down and the hunt for rebels began, the Carolinians were in no mood to be charitable. Not that they ever were. And so all of the horrifying things they had done to terrorize the population of enslaved people, they did even more of that. And so we see just a horrific outbreak of racial violence in Carolina in the weeks that followed this rebellion as an example, as a means of terror, of using terror to terrorize the majority population, which was enslaved African Americans and Africans, into submission. After the rebellion, we see another slew of laws passed by the Carolina legislature that basically lock down rights and any remaining loopholes for freedom, or dare I call it fresh air, from enslaved people. Enslaved people had been allowed to read. Now they were banned from reading. They were banned from learning the English language, written English language, and literacy. There was a tightened up pass system. African people couldn't travel anywhere without a piece of paper that gave permission for them to travel and specifically explained the purpose of that travel and the expected timeline when they should return and all of that. African Americans were not allowed to gather together in any numbers because they might be plotting. And in an ironic twist, the Carolina legislature attempted to create some Christian schooling for enslaved Africans, the idea being that many of them were Catholics, although not all. There are actually a good number of Muslim Africans in the Carolinas. So yes, Islam is in America from all the way back in the colonial day. But the idea was, if they could control Christianity, they could use all of those bits of the Bible that preach acceptance of fate and obedience to your master, and obedience as a way of psychologically controlling the remaining enslaved African Americans. It doesn't work. And in fact, according to some accounts, Gary Nash at the Unknown American Revolution, at the dawn of the American Revolution, most Africans and African Americans in the 13 colonies were still not practicing Christians one way or another. Either they were practicing Muslims, or they still practiced their traditional African beliefs, or they simply had time for none of it. So this is kind of the outbreak. So what are the lessons here from this Jemmy's rebellion, the Stono Rebellion it's called? Well, there's a couple of things. One is that the Carolinians inspired the rebellion through their violent and horrific treatment of the people they enslaved. That those who were treated nicely actually were the ones more likely to betray the plots. Secondly, that Africans coming into the Americas in the 1730s were still Africans. They spoke their languages, they retained their cultures, they were aware of their cultures. And so, far from the old mythology that Africans are stripped of their culture because of slavery, what we know is that Africans and African Americans retained their culture it might have transformed because all culture transforms over time. But when there's a constant influx of Africans coming from the home country or the home region, those individuals refresh the cultural awareness. And so there are these strains of West Central African culture that have persisted in the Carolinas to this day, the same way you can find those elements of West African culture in the Caribbean and all across the work of anthropologists like Zora Neale Hurston, for example, that trace these roots, Melville Herskovitz. Secondly, it's that the Carolinians were right to be afraid of rebellion. Freedom is a virtue that is not unique to the English as much as they like to speak of their liberties. And so the Angolans and all the other Africans who were enslaved, they might play the game of, yep, sure, okay, I accept my fate, but there's always those opportunities, and there is always that thought of when can I do it and when can I get away. And Jemmy was very clearly, and his band was headed south towards San Augustine to join the garrison there. And so all the contention of first British North America and then the United States with Florida was entirely valid, because despite Spanish atrocities, and again, never forget, the Spanish are atrocious as well, the organization of Spanish colonial life provided opportunities for enslaved Africans, particularly the Catholic and Portuguese and Spanish-speaking ones, of which there are many, that they did not have in the Carolinas, in which they were willing to risk rebellion, and risk all of the negative consequences that could result for their chance to enjoy everything the Carolinians wanted: their own land, citizenship, the right to have their own families and control over their own families. So I'll show you the book on the Carolinas from 1670 to Stono was called Black Majority. It's by Peter Wood. It was originally written in the 70s, and so this is one of those first, what they call, revisionist histories. And what we mean by revisionist histories is that it looks at evidence and it undermines the dominant self-serving story with new complexity. Peter Wood clearly demonstrated the rebellious spirit of Africans, the retention of their culture, and also the violent brutality of these Carolina Barbados sugar planters who transplant themselves and bring their violent culture to the American mainland in the time before the American Revolution. All right, are there any questions? I'm trying to cut them a little shorter. I keep running long. I'll provide a link to the book if anyone's interested in reading it. It's a very detailed book, which means it's not an easy read, but it's just full of names and documents and just a great deal of the reality of South Carolina life in the run-up to the American Revolution and this literal majority slave society. It also helps explain South Carolina today and throughout U.S. history as the state and colony that was always reluctant to be part of the United States and reluctant to sign on to broad declarations of freedom and liberty. But it also explains why South Carolina, during the Reconstruction, was the only state that actually had a black majority government. So, history informs a great deal of interesting things. I agree with you, Jay. I mean, Charleston today, a city that is a beautiful city built on the systematic, violent exploitation of African Americans. Any other questions? I'll wait like 30 seconds for any other questions, and then I'm going to call it a day. And I'm sorry for the late start. I lost track of time and then somehow lost track of technology. So I'm glad you enjoyed it, Nicole. You can imagine me as a college kid learning this stuff in college and being just completely just blown away at just how much there was that I had not even a hint existed. And in fact, I don't know if any of you saw the article, but I was that one of the things we should teach. I know we can't teach everything, but we need to teach clearly that we don't teach everything, because I had no idea that there was so much to learn in the first place. And then when I did, it just kind of blew open my entire understanding of my country, the world, and history more generally. Oh, there's more comments. Sorry, I got to push through the scroll. Yep, Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was the man. He was an incredible human being down from Beaufort. Maybe I'll tell his story next week, Jay. Maybe. At some point I will, because he was an incredible human being and a truly inspiring American leader. Alrighty. I'm going to call it a day. I'm going to say goodbye to you. I'm wearing my Act Philly t-shirt. Dop Don't Shop too. Oh, Lynn. The Tulsa Massacre. Uh, yeah. Uh, just one last tidbit, because Lynn, you gave me the opening. As late as 1791. So 1791, the presidency of George Washington, South Carolina sentenced an African American man to death by being burned at the stake. So that means not just lynchings, which are horrifying in and of themselves, and obviously could be an entire other lesson, but through a legal process under the Constitution, which specifically bans cruel and unusual punishment, an individual was sentenced, and the sentence was carried out to be burned at the stake in 1791 in South Carolina. Which, of course, suggests exactly why such horrifying events persist in U.S. history, quote, outside the law. Although I'll also point out the son of the Revolutionary era governor of South Carolina, his name was John Lawrence, was actually an abolitionist. That is the story from Cassandra's question, Jay. Today, this story was the rebellion. Because she had asked about, I forgot what it was specifically she had asked, but it led me to cover this week. Alrighty. I'll provide a link to the book, although I won't provide you the link on Amazon. You might be able to find it elsewhere, but it is an excellent book for those of you who are interested in this deep, deep history and kind of the cultural foundations of our country. Alrighty, everybody. Have a beautiful and wonderful day. I will make sure this video is attached to the event. I'm still not sure exactly what went wrong with my event planning this week. So I will see you all next week. I don't have a clear idea of what I'll cover. Maybe Robert Smalls, maybe not. But I'll cover Robert Smalls eventually, because he's just that cool. And we should have some good stories, too, out of South Carolina. And Robert Smalls is one of the great, great stories, American stories. Alrighty. All the best, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.